So Zelensky just called President Trump's bluff, and it kind of pissed off the Russians. I mean, Trump earlier today called on Ukraine to have elections, saying that Ukraine may have gotten to a point where it is no longer a democracy. Then a few hours later, Zelensky said, let's do it. I'm ready. And I just don't think anyone was really expecting that. So here's President Trump earlier today calling on Ukraine to have elections.
Is it time for Ukraine to hold an election, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. It's been a long time. It hasn't been doing particularly well. Yeah, I think it's time. I think it's an important time to hold an election. You know, they're using war not to hold an election, but I would think the Ukrainian people would, should have that choice, and maybe Zelensky would win. I don't know who would win, but they haven't had an election in a long time. They talk about a democracy, but it gets to a point where it's not a democracy anymore.
Now, what's frustrating here is this is President Trump actively negotiating against himself. Like, what are we doing, man? So, as a little background, Russia for quite a while has said that Zelensky is not the legitimate leader of Ukraine. And the context they're putting that in is that any agreement that Zelensky signs is not valid. So if we're actually trying to put something in place that will last more than just a day or, does not provide Russia the opportunity at any point to say, wait a minute, that Zelensky guy, he wasn't actually in charge of Ukraine, so this thing isn't in effect anymore, then we probably shouldn't play into the Russian talking point that Zelensky is not the elected leader of Ukraine with the support of his government. What? Like President Trump right now, and there's reporting we'll get into here in a minute, is pressuring Ukraine to sign some sort of peace agreement by Christmas. This doesn't help it. It gives some legs to the idea that he is an illegitimate leader and then cannot sign this agreement. So great job there. Now, anyways, Zelensky pretty quickly said, I'm on board. Let's do this thing. Quote, I'm ready for elections. I will be in Ukraine tomorrow and expect proposals from our partners and lawmakers on legal changes to allow elections during martial law. Since this issue is being raised by the U.S. president and our European partners, I'll be brief. I'm ready. I ask the United States together with Europe to ensure security for the vote. If that is done, Ukraine can hold elections within 60 days. The logistics here is mind-boggling, and we like to just say, well, have an election. It has to happen. And look, I'm never going to argue against elections. The will of the people is the most important thing here, right? And look, Zelensky's approval has changed throughout the course of this war, but the idea of putting a free and fair election in place in a very short period of time in a war-ravaged country that is constantly under Russian bombardment is a monumental ask. And you have to think that U.S. government officials are aware of this. Like, this isn't just Preston in Tennessee that comes up with some of this stuff, right? Like, first off, free and fair is important here because just like Russia saying that Zelensky is not a legitimate leader right now, if there's even the slightest gap in the authenticity of this election, Russia is going to take advantage of that. So it can't be there. You have to have international observers on the ground across the board, making sure that this is up to par. Now, in order to do that and actually hold some sort of elections, you of course need at least a temporary ceasefire that Russia has never agreed to quite yet. All right, so that's a pretty big leap to assume that for this one thing, Russia actually would agree to a ceasefire. But let's say it happens. So you get a ceasefire all across the front that allows soldiers at the front to vote. And it would allow people across the country to gather at polling locations to cast their vote. It's a big risk, right? Russian drones and missiles have been crashing into Ukrainian cities multiple times a day, every day for a few years now. So that's really trusting Russia. But let's say we get to that point. What about campaigning? Talk about free and fair elections. A part of that is making sure that anybody that wants to run for office can. What about a soldier that's manning the front, or a battalion commander, or a brigade commander that is actively involved in military operations day in and day out? Are they going to have the opportunity to campaign? Probably not, because they're actively overseeing a war zone. So now you end up with, well, that ceasefire needs to be long enough for anybody who wants to run to actually put their name in the hat. Do you really think there's going to be a 60, 90, 120-day ceasefire so that Ukraine can have enough people campaigning for office? Get out of here. Like, there's no way Russia even says just a few moments ago that ain't going to happen. Talk about the actual people voting. What about the 10 million displaced? What are we going to do with that, right? Not everybody is in Ukraine, and this isn't even getting into the occupied territories that clearly they're not going to be able to vote. You think Russia's going to run ballots over to the Ukrainians that are trapped behind the lines in Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson down in Crimea? No, probably not. That's not going to happen. So they're not going to be able to vote. 10 million people abroad. We're going to mail in ballots? Is Is that what we're doing? I can't remember here in the U.S. if we're on board with mail-in ballots or if we're not. It seems to change a couple times every year, if that's a good thing or not. I find it hard to believe that we're going to go to Ukraine and say, hey, guys, guess what? We found this perfect solution. Mail-in ballots or digital voting with 10 million people scattered around the world. That is a surefire way to not be able on the back end to say that this was an absolutely free and fair election. It is so complicated to put this together. But either way, that's the ask we're laying on Ukraine right now that Zelensky says he's ready for. A key component here is, what if Zelensky wins? And I feel like Russia and maybe President Trump and the people, it's kind of coming from like the J.D. Vance camp in the administration. They're kind of painting this as the Ukrainian people don't like Zelensky. They want to oust him, and they'll get somebody in power that's just ready to like cede territory and give up everything to Russia. What if Zelensky wins the election? Because right now, that's what it looks like would happen. The Kyiv Independent just ran a story where they said only 20% of Ukrainians would vote for Zelensky in future presidential elections, according to a survey published today, December 9th. However, he remains the most popular candidate. Former Commander-in-Chief Zelensky, now Ukraine's ambassador to the UK, ranks second at 19%, and Budanov, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence, placed third with 5%. Around 24% of those asked couldn't decide or chose not to answer the question. So maybe he wins, maybe someone else does. I'm not sure Zelensky is the pro-Russian stooge that people might think he's going to be. That is ridiculous. And there's a real argument to be made that Zelensky coming in might double down in a lot of ways in making sure that Ukraine does not cede any territory. I mean, if you go with those three, Zelensky, Zelensky, and Budanov, do you think anyone in that list is more likely to accept the Russian demands as they sit right now? So again, to me, this whole they have to have elections, it's part of this Russian talking point to delegitimize Zelensky. And unfortunately, President Trump is playing right into it here, not helping the current negotiating position of either party, to be fair. Like, this just kicks things down the road. And it opens the door to like, all right, what if the next guy is more hardline? It's entirely possible. Now, I don't know how much we have to worry about this or even think about this, because Russia, for their part, has says we're just not going to agree to anything here. Military informant said, quote, "It is likely that by ensuring security for 60 days, Zelensky means the cessation of strikes by the Russian armed forces on Ukraine, which the EU and US should guarantee. Obviously, the goal here is not so much the elections themselves as 2 months of silence during the most difficult winter period, when power, water, and heating outages could become critical. The conclusion is that Russia has no reason to agree to this." And we have Russian diplomat Rodyo Mirishnik said, quote, "Zelensky's statement about his readiness to hold elections is an arrogant bluff and a manipulation of the rules. He is deliberately setting unacceptable conditions for their conduct." Kind of sounds like lose-lose. Zelensky has to hold elections because he's not a legitimate leader, but if he holds elections, that's not legitimate. It's a manipulation of the rules and an arrogant bluff. I don't know. I'm starting to think that maybe Russia isn't all concerned about Ukraine holding free and fair elections. Maybe they just want to call the leader of Ukraine illegitimate. I know that sounds crazy, but this all comes amidst new reporting that the United States is actually pushing Ukraine to agree to the new terms of a ceasefire proposal. The Financial Times just published an article earlier today where they say Ukrainian President Zelensky is being pressured by U.S. envoys for a swift response with an aim to agree to a ceasefire with Russia by Christmas. One of the Western officials described the Ukrainian side as being stuck between demands on territory they can't accept and a U.S. side they can't reject. There's been a lot of very valid conversation recently about kind of trying to pressure Zelensky into giving up territory that he cannot agree to. He would have to get the parliament to agree to that, and there does not appear to be widespread support in Ukraine for that. So what do we do if the United States position is counter to what the Ukrainian people want? My gut says they're probably going to shift and focus more on the partnerships with their EU partners, which we are seeing a little bit more and more here. Now, Axios, adding to this, said a Ukrainian official said the United States offer had worsened from Kyiv's perspective after Trump's advisors Witkoff and Kushner held a 5-hour meeting with Putin last week in the Kremlin. They say the U.S. proposal included harsher terms than previous versions on issues like territory and control of the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia, and it left key questions unanswered on security guarantees. Quote, it felt like the United States was trying to sell us in different ways the Russian desire to take the whole of Donbass, and that the Americans wanted Zelensky to accept all of it on the phone call. So the idea here is the U.S. delegation made their way into the Kremlin, had a 5-hour talk with Putin, and came out with stricter demands, more demands in favor of Russia than Ukraine. This is a theme where we are trying to layer as much pressure as we can on Ukraine, seemingly incapable of adding pressure to Russia, which is beyond me. On top of this, we're seeing Ukraine time and again kind of come to the table and say they're ready for anything. Zelensky has said that he's ready for an energy ceasefire as soon as Russia is. Just today. Came out a few moments ago. We also have Zelensky, of course, saying that he's ready for elections right now. Let's do it. From the other side, Vladimir Putin just today put out a note saying, quote, talking about the Donbass, it's important territory, our historical territory. Absolutely. Russia was created in such a way that this was always part of Russia. There's no question about that. It's simply a natural thing, a historical fact. And we will, of course, bring this matter to its logical conclusion until the goal of the special military operation is achieved. So just today, you can see Russia digging in, saying we are going to take what we said we are going to take, and Ukraine saying, well, yeah, we're on board with the ceasefire. Oh, elections? You guys want elections? We'll do that. We can find a way. It's frustrating to see it continue to play out this way. Now, there are other options that appear to be making their way to the table. Finland's foreign minister, Elina Valtonen, was on CNN, I think it was, talking about the European plan, where she said this strategy, it's the correct one. And personally, I tend to agree, but here's what she has to say about that.
I think Europe's strategy for the past almost 4 years has been exactly the right one. So we have been supporting Ukraine. We have been draining Russia's war machine through sanctions. And we have been ramping up our own defense and deterrence. And this is exactly the right strategy also going forward, whether there's a peace deal or no. I think President Trump's goal of ending the killing, to stop the killing, is exactly the right one. And I think the next most important step to take in that direction would to impose a full ceasefire. Because that would show that Russia, at the end of the day, could potentially be interested in peace, which so far I haven't seen any sign of. And that time could be used to really negotiate a proper peace deal because...
Now, the pushback I would have there is that it's been too slow and that Europe is not moving fast enough. We're seeing a bit of renewed action now that President Trump is kind of pressuring Ukraine to take what would likely be just a deal of appeasement and kick the can down the road for what appear to be U.S. business interests or business interests of a few people here in the United States. But President Trump was asked about this in that interview with Politico, where he said, you know, Europe can keep continuing to assist Ukraine if they want to until they drop. Let's give that a quick listen.
The founding consensus in Europe right now is that they want to keep supporting Ukraine until they can win this war.
Until they drop, yeah.
Well, is that realistic in your view?
I mean, look, then they should support it. Europe is, I'm friendly with all of them. I mean, I like all of them. I have no real enemy. I've had a couple that I didn't like over the years. I actually like the current crew. I like them a lot.
And that brings us to kind of this weird spot that the United States has placed itself in over the course of the last year, where we very clearly still want to affect the outcome of this war and want it to be in our best interests, however it shakes out. But we're also kind of doing away with all of the leverage points we had. I mean, a great example of this would be weapon shipments, where I would argue that sending more weapons to Ukraine applies leverage to Russia, forcing them to the negotiating table, or at least it's a possibility. The other side of that is if we dial back or turn off completely weapon shipments to Ukraine, it can be a threat to kind of force their hand to accept something they might not otherwise accept. But we just turned off weapon shipments a while ago. Like, they're steadily decreasing, and now they're just like non-existent. The United States is really not playing much of a role at all in Ukraine's ability to defend themselves today. So we want to be able to have that leverage, but we've kind of done away with that leverage already. It's a weird setup. And the Finnish foreign minister here, I think, brought up a good point where she said, you know, this isn't Trump's war. And he's said over and over again how this has been forced upon him. But she says, he will be judged with the peace deal that he helps to implement.
It must be said that for President Trump, he, of course, keeps emphasizing that this is not his war. Well, indeed, it's not his war. But the peace deal will be President Trump's peace. And every day thereafter, he will be also judged by that. So it's very much in the interest of President Trump as well and the United States that we work together on a plan which makes this peace not only just, but very much sustainable also.
Now, speaking of getting judged, the Russians today are trolling President Trump, actually. And I'm not convinced, just based off of the statements we're seeing from Russia, that they are taking this very seriously at all. Again, we've kind of talked through this. Like, Putin just continually says, we're going to continue to do what we're doing. I think they're kind of laughing at some of our proposals here for peace. President Trump, in that interview earlier today, talked about Crimea, and the Russians jumped on this, kind of trolling him. But first, let's give that clip a listen.
Because Crimea was the heart. You know, I'm a real estate person at heart, right? I'm very good at real estate. And every time I look at that map, I said, oh, this Crimea is so beautiful. Wow. It's surrounded on 4 sides by ocean.
Now, that clip spread pretty far and wide across Russian social media, and 2 majors jumped on it by saying, quote, Politico had to conduct a new interview with Trump. The genius of world politics once again demonstrated that he is well-versed in the subject matter. The level of professionalism is impressive. It would be nice to add more geographical information to the historical references in the negotiations, even at a school level. Now, don't get me wrong. Russia takes every opportunity and has for a long time to mock any U.S. senior official. That's not new, and it's not unique to Trump, not by a long shot. But I think it kind of highlights how they're viewing these ceasefire negotiations. This is a big deal. We're talking about trying to bring about an end to the largest land war in Europe since World War II. Ukraine is taking it seriously. I think some in the United States are taking it seriously. Unfortunately, I think some also were just getting frustrated that it hasn't magically stopped on its own. But when you look at Russia and their actions and their statements over the course of the last year since President Trump has entered office, there's not a single indication that they actually care about getting to peace. Everything they put out is very similar to Vladimir Putin earlier today, saying we are going to accomplish our goals in the special military operation. We are going to take all of that territory. So I think 2 majors kind of mocking Trump, talking about the negotiations, is pretty fitting for how these talks have been going. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.